She barked at him like he was nothing, just another frail, wrinkled old man sitting in the wrong seat. But 5 minutes later, the entire flight stopped, the captain stepped out of the cockpit and saluted. What could make a man in uniform pause a packed commercial flight, with passengers fuming and time ticking? Who was this old man that even the pilot stood at attention for? And why did everyone on board feel a sudden wave of guilt they'd never forget? It started like any other boarding process: impatient travelers, overhead compartments filling up, the subtle buzz of safety announcements. But the energy shifted the moment a well-dressed woman in her early 40s stepped into first class and stopped dead in the aisle. Her face twisted into confusion, then annoyance, as she stared at the elderly man already seated in what she believed was her seat. He looked up slowly, blinking behind gold-rimmed glasses. His hands trembled slightly as he clutched a boarding pass in one hand and an old leather hat in the other, stained and frayed at the edges. The woman exhaled sharply, already raising her voice. "Excuse me, sir. That's my seat. 1A, you're in my seat." Passengers turned to look, eyes flitting between the standing woman and the seated man. He said nothing, just offered his boarding pass with an apologetic glance, eyes cast downward. The flight attendant approached, clearly sensing the tension, and asked both passengers to show their tickets. The woman didn't wait. She launched into a tirade about airlines always messing up, about how she paid good money to sit in first class and how she had no time for this nonsense. "He probably wandered in here by mistake," she scoffed, waving dismissively at the man. The old man still hadn't spoken. His shoulders remained hunched, as though trying to disappear into the cushioned seat. The flight attendant, calm but clearly flustered, took the boarding passes and examined them. Her brow furrowed. "They both say 1A, she mumbled, puzzled. The woman crossed her arms with a smug grin, sure she'd be proven right. "Then it's obvious. He must have been assigned wrong. Just fix it and get him out of my seat." But the flight attendant didn't move right away. She stared at the system screen, her fingers hesitating as if she wasn't sure what she was seeing. Meanwhile, the passengers around them began whispering. Some shook their heads at the woman's attitude. Others simply stared, unsure whose side to take. The man clutched his duffel bag tighter. The woman leaned in, her voice now dripping with condescension. "Sir, I don't know how you got this seat, but you need to move to the back where you belong. I've had a long day, and I don't have time for charity cases sitting in luxury." A sharp gasp came from a teenage girl a few rows back. The tension grew thick. The man looked like he might speak, but he didn't. He simply adjusted the brim of his weathered hat and tried to smile politely. The flight attendant asked him gently, "Sir, do you mind standing for just a moment while we check this?" He nodded and rose slowly, one hand bracing his knee as he stood. He stepped aside without a word. The woman dropped into the seat with satisfaction and adjusted the seatbelt like she was claiming a throne. But just as the attendant began to tap further into the tablet, something odd happened. A red alert popped on her screen. She froze. Her eyes darted toward the cockpit, then back to the old man who was now standing quietly in the aisle. She turned and briskly walked toward the front of the plane, her face pale. Passengers exchanged confused looks. The woman was too busy scrolling on her phone to notice. The old man stood there with a straight back now, looking out the window. Then, as the first-class curtain swished open, the pilot himself stepped into the cabin. Every head turned. He wasn't smiling. His eyes scanned the passengers until they landed on the old man, and then something extraordinary happened. His face changed completely. Shock. Recognition. Then reverence. "Sir," the pilot said, voice shaky, "is your name John Mercer?" The old man nodded. And that's when the pilot snapped to attention, saluted sharply, and said, "I'm honored to fly you today. On behalf of every soul on this plane, thank you." The moment the pilot saluted, the entire cabin went still. It wasn't just surprise, it was a kind of silence that felt heavy, like the air had been pulled from the room. Passengers leaned in, curious and unsure. The woman in 1A slowly raised her eyes from her phone, confused by the sudden attention the man she had just humiliated was receiving. The old man, John Mercer, offered the pilot a small nod, still saying nothing. His voice hadn't been heard by anyone yet, and somehow that made everything feel even more mysterious. The pilot, clearly moved, shook John's hand with both of his, then turned to the flight attendant and whispered something in her ear. She immediately gestured for John to return to his seat. The woman in 1A had no choice but to get up. Her body stiff, her eyes wide, she stepped aside. John didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply sat down again, quietly, gently, with the grace of someone used to being overlooked. A few minutes later, the plane was in the air, but the passengers were restless. The strange encounter had opened a door none of them expected, and now curiosity filled the cabin. Who was this man? Why had the pilot saluted him like that? Whispers floated through the air like turbulence. The teenage girl from earlier, seated near the front, leaned over to her father. Is he famous or something? Her father shrugged, but his eyes didn't leave the old man. In row 2B, a young businessman tapped quietly on his phone, searching the name John Mercer but getting no clear result. The old man simply stared out the window, his fingers tapping gently on the armrest in a steady rhythm. A few rows back, a quiet steward, James, moved toward John with a soft smile. Would you like anything to drink, sir? John turned slowly and smiled. Just water, thank you. His voice was low but warm, carrying a tone of someone who had seen both war and peace and preferred the latter. James couldn't help but glance at the worn duffel tucked beneath John's feet. It looked like it had survived decades. A tiny tag hung from it, cracked and fading. Only part of a name remained. Mercer, J.L. Next to it, a series of numbers were written in black ink. Military numbers. James looked back up at John, wondering if this was the same Mercer his grandfather had once told him about. Back in the cockpit, the co-pilot whispered, "Is that who I think it is?" The pilot gave a slow nod. If I'm not wrong, that man flew over 60 missions in Vietnam. He was awarded the Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, and, his voice dropped, he saved my father's life. The co-pilot blinked in surprise. You're serious? The pilot nodded again, eyes moist now. Dead serious. And that's not the kind of man you let stand in the aisle while someone insults him. He paused for a moment before adding, my dad told me if I ever met John Mercer, I was to thank him. Personally. The cabin suddenly seemed a little smaller, a little more sacred. Meanwhile, the woman who had demanded John move earlier now sat in economy, fuming quietly. Her pride wouldn't let her show embarrassment, but the shame was bubbling beneath her skin. People weren't making eye contact with her. Some passengers whispered while glancing her way. She tried to pretend she didn't care, but her jaw clenched tighter with every passing second. Her business suit, once sharp and pristine, now felt stiff and suffocating. She couldn't forget the way John had looked at her, not with anger, not with contempt, but with something worse, understanding. As if he'd seen people like her many times before, and never expected better. A man across the aisle from John leaned in, clearly curious. Sir, I don't mean to intrude, but, that salute from the captain, are you someone important? John smiled softly. No more important than anyone else on this flight, he said. Then, after a pause, he added, but I've been lucky enough to come back when others didn't. The man nodded, unsure how to respond. John reached into his bag and pulled out a small photo, worn at the edges, showing a group of young men in military uniforms smiling in front of a dusty helicopter. He stared at it for a long moment, his smile fading into something deeper. These were my brothers, he said quietly. We were kids. But the skies aged us fast. Suddenly, the atmosphere on the plane changed. People who moments ago were just eager to get to their destinations were now sitting up straighter, listening more, judging less. Even the children grew quiet, sensing something important was happening without fully understanding what it was. A flight that began like any other was becoming something else entirely, something sacred, like a moment in time they would tell others about. In first class, a woman dabbed at her eyes. A businessman closed his laptop, realizing whatever he was working on could wait. A young man removed his headphones. John Mercer, with his stained hat and trembling hands, had not said much. But somehow, without trying, he had shifted the energy of 100 strangers mid-air. And as the clouds rolled outside the window, one truth became clear. The most powerful people are often the ones who say the least and carry the most. After the moment of respect passed and the pilot quietly returned to the cockpit, things didn't fully settle. The woman had reluctantly moved to economy, but her complaints didn't stop there. She leaned over to a flight attendant, voice lowered but edged with anger, demanding answers. Why did he have the same seat as me? That's not normal. You people messed something up. The flight attendant, trying to stay calm, offered to double-check the passenger manifest. She didn't want more trouble, especially not after what had just happened, but she could see the woman wasn't going to let this go. As she walked to the front, she took out her small tablet and started pulling up the seat assignments again. But something strange happened. The screen glitched. Then, a red notice appeared, Seat 1A, VIP allocation, flagged Do Not Alter. She frowned and tapped further. The flight records showed that the seat hadn't been booked by a passenger, it had been manually reserved by someone at corporate level. Not a name, not a regular booking. Just a note, hold for guest of honor. Travel courtesy of the airline. ID verified. Mercer, JL. The attendant's eyes widened. This wasn't just a mistake. It was intentional. Someone high up in the airline had specifically set aside the seat. Not for a celebrity. Not for a company executive. For John Mercer. But why? She turned toward the cockpit, unsure whether to interrupt again. The plane was at cruising altitude, and passengers had begun settling in. Drinks were being served. Movies were starting. And yet, this unease lingered, like an unspoken truth rippling under the surface. The attendant walked down the aisle, her mind racing. As she passed John again, she noticed something she hadn't before. A small patch sewn onto his duffel bag. The insignia wasn't recent. It was old, faded, but clearly military. Above it, stitched in careful thread, was the word rescue. A simple word that now felt full of weight. Meanwhile, the woman in economy wasn't letting it go. She flagged down another flight attendant and complained loudly that she deserved compensation for being moved. I was humiliated in front of the whole plane, she said. You should give me something. A voucher. An upgrade. I paid for that seat. Her voice rose loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, and the awkward glances returned. A mother with a toddler covered her child's ears as the woman continued to rant. But her words weren't landing the same anymore. People were beginning to look at her differently. Before, they might have agreed. Now, they seemed to shrink away, embarrassed for her more than with her. Back near the galley, two flight attendants were whispering. Do you know who he is? One asked. Only what the captain said, the other replied. But something big's going on. His seat was flagged before we even got the manifest. There's no paper ticket in the system. Everything was done manually, like old protocol. The other nodded. My uncle used to work military airlift. Said sometimes they'd give honorary flights for legends. Real ones. Not generals. Not officers. Quiet guys who saved people and disappeared after. They both turned to look at John, still seated calmly by the window, his weathered hands folded in his lap. In the cockpit, the captain had pulled out his personal sat phone. He wasn't required to make any call, but something told him this wasn't just a lucky coincidence. He dialed a number and waited. A gruff voice on the other end answered. General Lyles, the voice said. The captain cleared his throat. Sir, this is Captain Ray Owens, Delta Flight 627 to Chicago. I believe we have a passenger on board you might know, John Mercer. There was silence. Then the general's tone changed. You're sure? Yes, sir. The general took a deep breath. Fly him safely, Captain. That man once flew through enemy fire to save a downed team, including me. He shouldn't be in the air right now. He should be in every textbook. You tell your crew, and you tell your passengers if they ask, he's the reason some of us ever came home. Down below, John remained still. A child passed him, wobbling down the aisle. She paused, staring at his hat. Are you a cowboy? She asked, pointing at the old leather. John smiled gently. Something like that. Her mother quickly pulled her away, embarrassed, but John chuckled quietly. The innocence warmed the air. Moments later, the first flight attendant returned with a bottle of water and a folded envelope. "Sir," she said softly, "this was given to me by my supervisor. Said it was mailed here weeks ago, to be handed to you once seated." John took it slowly, surprised. He opened it and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It wasn't typed. It was handwritten in blue ink, the penmanship neat but firm. It read, "Mr. Mercer, it has come to our attention through channels we trust that you once risked your life for a group of young men in a country far from home. One of those men went on to build a family, who now includes a director at this airline. Please accept this flight, and this seat, as a small token of thanks from people who never forgot. We hope your journey is peaceful. Delta Airlines, Honor Division." John folded the letter quietly and returned it to the envelope. He didn't show emotion, but something behind his eyes softened. The tension in his shoulders loosened. He stared out the window again, but this time with a smile. The clouds outside looked a little brighter, and somewhere in the rows behind him, passengers who once looked at him as just another old man were beginning to understand. Sometimes the people who change the world don't carry fame. They carry silence, scars, and stories too big for words. The captain sat in silence for a moment after the call ended, the voice of General Lyles still ringing in his ears. The words hadn't been long or dramatic, but the weight behind them was heavy. "He's the reason some of us ever came home." That wasn't just respect, it was reverence. Captain Owens leaned back in his seat, the hum of the engine surrounding him like white noise, but his thoughts were loud. His fingers hovered over the intercom switch. He thought about making an announcement, about telling the passengers who they were flying with. But something told him that this wasn't a moment for speeches. This was a moment for action. Quiet, strong action, the kind John Mercer had probably shown all his life. He leaned forward, flipped the switch that opened the cockpit door, and stepped out into the aisle once again. As the captain passed through the cabin, eyes turned toward him. Most assumed something was wrong, a delay or turbulence maybe, but they were wrong. He moved with purpose, walking past row after row of passengers, until he stopped beside John's seat. This time, he knelt. Not to draw attention. Not to be dramatic. But to speak on level ground. "Mr. Mercer," he said softly, "I wanted you to know something." John looked at him, surprised. "Sir." The captain continued. "My father served in Vietnam. He told me stories when I was young, about a rescue team that flew through a storm of gunfire to pull men out of a burning camp. He said their bird came from nowhere and vanished just as fast. He never got the name of the pilot. But last year, before he passed, he told me if I ever met a man named John Mercer, I was to shake his hand and say thank you." The captain's voice cracked slightly. "So, thank you." John's eyes welled, but he blinked it back. "I remember that mission," he said quietly. "Camp Echo. February. We almost didn't make it." The captain nodded. "He said you did. And that you were the reason his kids got to know their father." Around them, the cabin was dead silent. No one had touched their drinks. Even the babies weren't crying. It was like the air itself was waiting, holding its breath. Then, the captain did something no one expected. He stood, turned to face the passengers, and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I won't take much of your time, but I think you deserve to know who's flying with you today." He paused. In seat 1A is a man who risked his life for others without ever asking for attention. He didn't tell us who he was. He didn't ask for anything. But this airline, and I, recognize him. A quiet gasp ran through the rows. People craned their necks to see John, who now sat awkwardly in the spotlight. The captain continued, "John Mercer flew over 60 missions in Vietnam, many without backup, and saved more lives than we'll ever know. He was never decorated in front of cameras. He never wrote a book. But he is a hero. A real one." His voice grew firm. "I'm stopping this flight for one moment, not because of protocol or safety, but because it's the right thing to do. For all of us who get to live in peace because men like him flew straight into war." With that, the captain turned, stood at attention, and saluted again. This time, something incredible happened. One by one, passengers stood. No one told them to. No one asked. But they stood. In economy. In first class. In the back galley. People stood quietly, some with tears in their eyes, some with their hands over their hearts. A few veterans aboard instinctively saluted too. The woman who had once yelled at John sat frozen. Her arms were locked to her sides. Her eyes filled with tears she didn't understand, shame spreading through her like a wave she couldn't stop. The captain nodded respectfully and returned to the cockpit, leaving behind a cabin that no longer felt like a plane but something closer to a sanctuary. People began to sit again, but the hush remained. It wasn't awkward anymore, it was reverent. As if everyone had agreed, without a word, that this flight was now more than a trip. It was a tribute. Near the back, a young man pulled out his phone, intending to post what he'd just witnessed. But as he started typing, he stopped. Something didn't feel right. This wasn't a story for likes or shares. This was something to remember in silence. Something to tell his children someday. Something to carry. Back in his seat, John stared out the window again, but this time he wasn't watching the clouds. He was lost in memory. Not in pride, but in faces. Names. Friends he hadn't spoken of in years. Faces that never grew old. A tear slipped down his cheek, and he didn't wipe it away. At that moment, he wasn't alone anymore. The cabin wasn't just filled with strangers, it was filled with witnesses. Witnesses to a moment that proved something simple and rare, that dignity, sacrifice, and humility still meant something in the world. And that sometimes, even in the chaos of travel and noise, people can still stop and remember. The cabin returned to motion, but not to normal. People shifted in their seats, eyes lowered, heads heavy with thought. Even the routine clinks of beverage carts and rustling of snack bags felt quieter, more respectful. John Mercer sat in 1A, not with pride but with peace, unaware of just how many minds were racing behind him. One man, one quiet presence, had shifted the weight of an entire flight without raising his voice. As the plane cruised through the sky, passengers began thinking less about the time they would land and more about the journey itself. They watched John with a new kind of attention, not for entertainment, but for understanding. Some whispered softly to the person beside them. Others simply stared ahead, unsure how to process what they had witnessed. Back in the cockpit, the captain stared out into the vast sky ahead, his hands resting lightly on the controls. He wasn't thinking about flight paths or arrival gates. He was thinking about how quickly life passes, how people forget, and how a single moment can make time stand still. The co-pilot didn't say much either. He had grown up in a generation that knew of war only through textbooks and movies. Yet, seeing a living piece of that history in the seat behind them made it feel real in a way he never expected. "He doesn't even want the recognition," the co-pilot said softly. "He didn't ask for this." The captain nodded. "And that's why he deserves it." In economy, the woman who had started it all sat frozen, her fingers twisted in her lap. She had checked her phone 3 times but couldn't bring herself to open any apps. Her perfectly applied makeup now felt like a mask she wanted to peel away. She tried to remember exactly what she had said to him, word for word, and the more she remembered, the more ashamed she became. Her voice, loud, cold, dismissive, now echoed in her head like an alarm. She hadn't just asked him to move. She had demanded it. Insulted him. Treated him like he was nothing. But he never raised his voice. He didn't even defend himself. He let her win, because to him, the seat didn't matter. The same couldn't be said for her. The seat had been her identity in that moment, her proof of worth. And now, it was a reminder of her worst moment. The man next to her gave her a quick glance, then looked away. She caught it. That look. The one people give when they know something about you that you wish they didn't. It wasn't cruelty. It was disappointment. And somehow, that felt worse. She reached down and grabbed a napkin from the tray table, trying to act like she had something in her eye, but the tears were already coming. Quiet, hot, and full of regret. She didn't want forgiveness. She just wanted to take it all back. But she knew she couldn't. Meanwhile, near the back, a teenage boy who had been quiet the entire flight stood up and approached the nearest flight attendant. He whispered something to her, and she looked surprised, then nodded. She walked quickly toward the front of the plane and whispered something to John. At first, he looked puzzled, but then stood, using the armrest to help himself up. The attendant gently guided him down the aisle, toward the back. As he walked, passengers parted like waves, eyes following him, silence heavy. John didn't rush. Every step was steady, deliberate. When he reached the rear galley, he found the teenager waiting. The boy held out a small notebook. It was filled with airplane sketches and dream jobs scribbled in pencil. "I want to be a pilot someday," the boy said. "But today I learned I want to be someone worth remembering, like you." He handed John the notebook. "Can you sign it?" John blinked, overwhelmed. He took the notebook, found a blank page, and slowly wrote, "To someone brave enough to dream, keep flying, and always protect others along the way. Him." The boy beamed and hugged him tightly, catching John off guard. It was the first time anyone had touched him in years without caution or pity. Just honest respect. When John returned to his seat, there was a sealed envelope waiting on the tray table. He opened it carefully. Inside was a folded certificate, Lifetime Miles Award, in honor of service beyond measure. The note attached read, "This flight is only one of many we hope you take, always in seat 1A. With gratitude, the airline team." He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes. It was too much, but it was also something he hadn't known he needed. Back in the cabin, another unexpected thing happened. A man stood up and asked if he could say a few words. The flight attendant hesitated, then nodded. The man turned to face the rows. "I didn't know Mr. Mercer until today," he began. "But I know what he represents. And I think we all needed to be reminded that heroes don't need cameras. They don't need applause. They need to be seen. And heard. And thanked." He looked at John and nodded. "Thank you for not yelling back. Thank you for showing us what true strength looks like." People clapped softly. Not a loud, showy kind of applause, but the kind that came from the heart. The kind that meant something. And in that moment, thousands of feet above the ground, a group of strangers became something like a family. Not forever. Not even for the rest of the flight. But for those few hours, they shared something rare, a truth, a reckoning, a salute that went far beyond uniforms. As the plane neared its final descent, the sky outside began to change color. The bright daylight softened into golden hues, casting a warm glow across the clouds and through the cabin windows. It was the kind of light that made people pause, not because they had to, but because it felt meaningful. Passengers started packing up their bags, tucking away snacks and slipping on shoes, but something was different. There was no rush. No chatter. No one scrambling to be first off the plane. Instead, a stillness remained, an unspoken understanding that they had been part of something they would carry with them long after landing. At the front, John Mercer sat with his hands folded, looking out at the glowing horizon. The folded certificate remained on his lap, his fingers resting gently on the name he hadn't heard spoken in years, his own, attached to a gesture of thanks too big for words. The intercom crackled to life again, and the voice of Captain Owens filled the cabin, steady and calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Chicago. Estimated time to landing is 23 minutes. On behalf of the entire crew, thank you for flying with us today. And one last thing, thank you again to Mr. John Mercer for flying with us. We are honored to have shared this space with you." A ripple of soft applause moved through the rows again. It wasn't coordinated. It wasn't forced. It simply happened. Just as it had before. Quiet, respectful, and honest. In the back, the woman who had demanded John move now sat with her head bowed. She hadn't spoken since the salute. She hadn't tried to justify herself or make excuses. But something had changed in her face. The smugness was gone. The sharpness had dulled. She held her phone in her lap but hadn't touched it in an hour. Instead, she stared out the window, lost in thought. She knew she couldn't undo what she had said. The moment was etched in the minds of everyone aboard. But maybe there was still time to become someone better. Maybe this flight wasn't just a journey for John. Maybe it was a wake-up call for her. As the plane dropped lower through the clouds, she leaned toward the aisle, looking toward the front. John wasn't looking back. He never did. But that didn't stop the guilt that sat like a stone in her chest. A soft bell chimed overhead as the wheels lowered into place. The city skyline appeared in the distance, sharp against the setting sun. As the plane touched down, tires squealing gently against the tarmac, the cabin exhaled together. The lights blinked. The brakes slowed. But no one stood. Not yet. People looked to John. He remained seated, calm as ever. When the seatbelt sign dinged and clicked off, only then did he rise. And as he did, the entire front section stood again, this time not for a salute, but to let him pass. No pushing. No grabbing luggage. Just a clear path from 1A to the front door. A ground agent waited at the end of the jet bridge, holding a clipboard. But beside her stood something unexpected, a uniformed officer from the local Veterans Affairs Department, and next to him, 2 younger pilots in dress blues. They saluted the moment John stepped off the plane. Behind them, a camera crew stood ready, but not close enough to invade. One of the young pilots stepped forward and handed John a folded American flag. "Sir, we were told you'd be arriving today. My grandfather served with you. He couldn't be here, but he wanted you to have this." John opened his mouth to reply but said nothing. Instead, he just nodded and held the flag close to his chest. Inside the terminal, word had spread. A small crowd had gathered near the gate exit. Travelers paused their calls, employees stepped away from their counters, and even TSA agents leaned over the rope barriers to get a better view. They weren't cheering. They weren't clapping wildly. They were watching, with quiet awe, as a man who had once flown through gunfire to save others now walked slowly through an airport filled with strangers who had finally learned his name. A little girl stepped forward from the crowd, holding a crayon drawing in her tiny hands. Her mother bent down and whispered, "Go ahead." The girl walked up to John and handed him the paper. It was a picture of an airplane with the words "Thank you," Hero written in big, crooked letters. John looked at it and smiled, really smiled, for the first time all day. He knelt carefully, shook her hand, and whispered, "That's the best thing I've ever been given." Her eyes lit up. The crowd stayed silent, watching a moment they would never forget. John continued on, slowly disappearing into the terminal, leaving behind a plane, a crew, and 100 people who would talk about this day for the rest of their lives. Some would tell the story at dinner tables. Others would post about it days later, struggling to find the right words. But all of them would remember the man with the stained hat who never asked for a thing, who gave without keeping score, and who reminded a full flight of strangers what true honor really looked like. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. The silence he left behind spoke volumes.